Today we're going to talk about persuasion, which is Unit 8 of the social psychology class. So let me bring up my PowerPoint. So we're going to be talking about how individuals and groups, corporations, all sorts of folks try to get us to change our attitudes or our behaviors. So our learning outcomes for this unit are going to be obviously to start with the vocabulary related to persuasion. By the end of the unit, we should be able to give a personal example of a persuasion attempt and apply the vocabulary from the unit to that example. We want to talk about the two different paths that lead to influence. We want to summarize elements of persuasion, and we also want to describe how persuasion can be resisted. Another topic that we will talk about in this unit is going to be what we call new religious movements, what some people previously have called cults, and we can talk about that as an application of the persuasion topics that we'll be looking at this unit. So first of all, we want to talk about what exactly is persuasion. So the technical definition of persuasion is a process by which a message induces change in beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. So let's break that down. A process, meaning that it's not going to happen in just one interaction. Typically, persuasion happens over multiple interactions, whether it be interactions with an advertisement, whether it be interactions with an individual and their attitudes. But persuasion typically is not going to happen just in one instance. It's going to happen over time. And the outcome of persuasion typically is going to be where some sort of message causes us to change our beliefs, our attitudes. Remember, attitudes are positive or negative evaluations of persons, places, or things. And it may also change our behaviors. So many times persuasion focuses on, or persuasion attempts focus on our values and how we want to be perceived. So if you look at this image over here, it says, buy this product and you'll be cool like the people in the advertisement. And so if one of our motives is to appear cool, then the person trying to persuade us, the group, the corporation trying to persuade us, may use that sort of tactic to get us to think, well, if I buy this purse, then I will be as cool as this person in this Instagram video, things like that. We can also talk about, in terms of persuasion, how is the persuasion working? So the channel of communication is how that information is given to us. So we might talk face-to-face with a friend, and that would be a face-to-face channel of communication. We may read something that is attempting to persuade us, maybe some news articles. Those are going to be in writing. Sometimes films persuade us to think differently, to behave differently. There's lots of documentaries out there that try to get us to think differently about maybe the experiences of natives in the United States, or maybe how food production influences animals, things like that. We can also think about social media in terms of a channel of communication for persuasion. We can think about, Instagram, we can think about Snapchat, we can think about TikTok, and how all of those have influenced or persuaded us to behave in different ways. We also want to think about what's called the two-step flow of communication. So let's say that a company works with an influencer and asks that influencer to promote their product, and in return they will receive free product from that corporation. So basically the communication comes from the corporation to the influencer, and then the influencer then influences or persuades us through maybe their social media posts to behave in a certain way, to buy a certain product, etc. So that's what we call the two-step flow of communication. So opinion leaders influence others. One example of that, there's a show that recently came on. It's called Inventing Anna, and it's on Netflix. And I distinctly remember watching it, and one of the characters they had gone to Morocco to go to this specific hotel, and one of the characters says, "Oh my gosh, this pool is exactly where Kim Kardashian was taking pictures of herself. I so want to take a picture of myself here." That would be the two-step flow of communication. These folks did not initially want to go to this hotel, but because a celebrity, an influencer, had posted that they had gone to the hotel, they then wanted to go to the hotel to see the hotel themselves, and then also to take photos of themselves. This can also be thought of in terms of what we call basking in reflected glory, or it's usually shortened to BIRG, berging. This is the idea that, you know, if someone else who was famous came to this place, then I want to come to this place too, in the hopes that I will be seen as cool or famous as this other individual. We can also think about two-step flow of communication in terms of the themes that we see in television. My son came to me the other day, he's 11, and we were making dinner, and I was making broccoli for dinner, and he loves broccoli. And he said to me, "Mom, why is it that so many kids that I know don't like vegetables?" And I was like, "Well, that's a great question." I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, a lot of times when you watch like TV shows or something like that, all of the kids on the TV shows will say like, 'Oh, vegetables, oh, broccoli.'" And he's like, "So maybe because they've watched this show, they developed this attitude of, you know, this negative attitude towards vegetables, even if they've never tried it." And so here's my 11-year-old already understanding persuasion attempts from television shows, and understanding that, you know, the two-step flow of communication is happening where this character is saying these negative things about vegetables, and the kids are picking up on it and saying the same things, even though, like I said, they've never tried it. So it's interesting to see how that two-step flow of communication can happen in terms of persuasion from even just watching, you know, television shows, YouTubers, things like that. So we said we were going to look at two specific routes to persuasion. So the central route to persuasion is when the person or corporation trying to persuade us focuses on logical arguments. So they give us facts, figures, statistics. That is what we call the central route to persuasion. The next one is the peripheral route to persuasion. This is where we focus on incidental cues, such as the attractiveness of the speaker, such as the attractiveness of the product. We also focus on maybe the credibility of the speaker or of the corporation. So if you think in terms of most of the advertisements that you see, most of the advertisements would fall into the peripheral route to persuasion. They've got a attractive speaker who maybe is popular, and this person is talking about how, you know, they like this product, and they're not really giving us factual information about the product. They're simply taking some of their you know, celebrity and trying to put it onto this product. And that's what the company is paying this person to do. So, you know, the hope of Lincoln is that if you like Matthew McConaughey, then you might also like Lincoln because Matthew McConaughey is in Lincoln commercials. So one thing that you'll start to do probably after this unit is to look more at advertisements and go like, well, where's the information? You know, what, you know, why should I buy this product? My 11-year-old came to me this morning and he said, "Mom, I want to go to Mr. Beast's burgers," which Mr. Beast, if you don't know, is a YouTuber. He was actually the highest grossing YouTuber last year. And one of the things that he's done is to create restaurants. And so I said, you know, I don't even know if there's a Mr. Beast burger in San Antonio. And so he Googles it and he said, "Yeah, there's 3 of them. I want to go to one." And I said, "Well, what kind of food do they serve?" And he's like, "Well, I'm assuming burgers." And I was like, okay. So he doesn't have much information. So not so much central routes to persuasion in terms of this. Instead, he's heard that, you know, lots of famous people have gone to Mr. Beast's burgers. He, my son likes Mr. Beast as a, you know, presenter. And so he wants to try Mr. Beast's burgers specifically for this peripheral focus on what Mr. Beast has been doing, as opposed to, looking at reviews from the actual restaurant that say, oh, the burgers are actually really good, or things like that. So a lot of the advertisements that we see focus on peripheral cues as opposed to focusing on central arguments. So if we take a look at this image here, if the goal is very powerful persuasion, we want to think about the motivation of the person who's receiving the message, and we want to address those. So if the motivations are to appear cool, if the motivations are to appear smart, we want to address those motivations in our message. We want, as a messenger, a speaker who appears to be credible and also local. What that could mean is, maybe someone who we know from our community, or someone who we know of through, social media, or because they are a celebrity. Local can also relate to how similar this person appears to me. So, for example, advertisements that target working moms will have women who appear to be working moms at about the same age demographic that the advertisement is targeting, so that the person receiving the message will go like, oh yeah, I'm similar to that. That's part of my identity. So maybe I should, try this product that they're advertising because it seems to work for this person who seems similar to me. And then we also want to think about the how. So we want to be tuned in as the messenger. We want to be tuned in to what is important to the people who are receiving our message. We want to be respectful of the person who is receiving our message. So saying things like, you're stupid if you don't buy this, is not going to be as effective as saying, smart people use Bounty paper towels. That indicates that we are being respectful towards the potential person watching this advertisement. So we bring all these things together. We address the motivations. We have a credible speaker who is known to the recipient of the message, and we have a message that is tuned into what is important and is respectful, and we are going to have what we think of as powerful persuasion. So we can also think about other influences on the persuasiveness of the messenger. So if the messenger is attractive, so if they're similar to me, then that is going to be more attractive to me as an individual. We also know that there's going to be some people who are just in general perceived to be more attractive than other people. So for example, there's the symmetry hypothesis, which is the idea that if a person's face is symmetrical, they are perceived to be more attractive in general to the average person than a person's face who is not symmetrical. What that means is that, so if I drew a line down the middle of my face and I could see that my ears were the same height, that my eyes were the same size, that my eyes were the same height, that, basically what is seen on one side is reflected on the other side. That is perceived by the general population to be more attractive than maybe someone who has one ear that's a little bit higher, or one eye that's a little bit higher, etc. We also know that a topic is more attractive to us if we're already interested in it. So, if there's an advertisement for something you don't care about, then it's going to be less influential than an advertisement for something that is of interest to you. So attractiveness both relates to the speaker and to the message. We can also think about how credible is this speaker. So, we don't want to hire a celebrity who knows nothing about our niche product and bring them in to speak about this product, because people who know about the product will know, like, this person doesn't know anything about what they're talking about. So we want to have a speaker that appears to be expert, knowledgeable in what they're talking about. So one of the things that's interesting is we can be an expert without having, 100% knowledge of everything about the topic. So generally, it's impossible to know every single thing about psychology, for example. And so one of the things that research has shown is that, let's say a student asks me a question and I'm not 100% on the actual answer to it. If I just, made something up and then the student did some research and found that I was incorrect, then their perception of me in terms of my expertise would decrease. Whereas if I said to the student, that's a fantastic question. Based upon what I've learned previously, with this research and that research, if we put the two results together, one would expect to find this, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly the answer to your question, but let's take a look and see if we can find out if there's any research that actually looks at your specific question. So basically I've indicated what, I'm not sure. But there's research, as we've talked about before, that shows that when people indicate that they are not 100% on the answer to a question, but that they're willing to look into it and get back to people, that people have more respect for that person than for someone who just, talks out of their butt and says oh, well, it's this. And then people find out that they're incorrect. So another thing that we know about experts is that a lot of times they have this available knowledge, crystallized knowledge of a topic. And many times, because they have so much knowledge about the topic, they tend to speak really quickly. And so one of the things that research has shown is that we perceive someone to be an expert if they talk really quickly about whatever they're talking about. And maybe that's because we think, well, they can't just talk really fast about stuff that they don't know, so they must know this topic really well. And then there's also the idea of trustworthiness. If we already perceive someone as non-trustworthy, let's say that they fall into a heuristic that we have of negative stereotypes about this group, then it can be challenging for us to perceive them as credible. For example, if I activate the heuristic of used car salespeople, many times students will go oh, I don't trust them. And so when I say, well, why not? And they say, well, all they're trying to do is sell me a car, and they might sell me a car that's a bad car. And I say, well, but that's illegal, right? Why would they do that? So if we already perceive this person as not trustworthy, then we already perceive them as not a credible speaker in terms of a messenger trying to persuade us. Okay, so expert and trustworthiness are going to be important if we want to make sure that we are perceived as a credible speaker. We can also think about the timing of a message. So let's say that we're on Shark Tank and we're trying to get our product funded, and there's 3 people presenting. So what the research shows is that the most remembered and usually the most liked presentation is going to be the first presentation. This is what we call the primacy effect. So if you can choose when you get to go first. A couple of reasons for that. One is people are still paying attention. And 2, they're more likely to be focused and listening to your actual arguments. Obviously, make sure that you're giving some central arguments if you're trying to persuade people to part with their money, right? So usually the first presentation has the most influence and is remembered the best. If you can't go first, then you should go last, because that's what we call the recency effect. The recency effect is when the most recent presentation is remembered best. A couple things about if you're going to go last. Remind people that you are the last presenter. Let's say that there's been 16 presentations today and you're last. By 16th presentation, the whole audience is just glazed over, and they're like, oh my gosh, looking at their watch, what time is it? This has been so long, right? So what we want to do is remind these folks hey, thank you so much for staying with us for all of these presentations. I know that you've heard a lot of information today. I am the last presenter. And as soon as you say that, it's almost like brain perks up and goes oh, this is the last one? Okay. And so they're back into the mode of paying attention. So remind people that you are the last presentation. And again, thank them for paying attention and focusing on your arguments, because it will kind of remind them to do so. Okay, so recency effect isn't as effective as the primacy effect, but again, if you can't go first, then you want to go last. One of the students in my face-to-face class the other day said, what if you have to do a speech and you know that it's horrible? And I said, then go somewhere in the middle. Then people will be less likely to remember it. So let's talk about the message. So we can think about, in terms of messages, does a message focus on reason? Does it focus on logic? Does it focus on specific information as to why we should want and or need this product? Or does it focus on emotions? So again, reason would be central, emotion would be not so much focused on the central arguments, right? So testimonials, typically where we have people say, I use this product and it helps me do X, Y, and Z, can be beneficial in terms of giving reason, but they also may focus on motion as opposed to focusing on the central route to persuasion. So you may think about some of the advertisements that you see and think, okay, what are they trying to do? One of the things that always frustrates me when I see an advertisement is seeing an advertisement that intentionally messes with your emotions. So for example, those Save the Animals advertisements with Sarah McLachlan music in the background, the Arms of the Angel song playing with all of these puppies that will be euthanized unless you donate. Like, oh my gosh, please turn that off, because it's making me angry that they're manipulating my emotions. And I also joke with my husband all the time, like, and if you don't turn it off, I will send all the puppies all of our money. So you want to think about, what is the actual message that this persuasion attempt is conveying? Is there actual, logical, concrete evidence, or are they simply trying to get you to be sad? And if you think about it, so the advertisement gets us to tries to get us to be sad, right? Which makes us experience cognitive dissonance. So we think like, oh my gosh, there's all these puppies in the world, and if I send them $5, then I can help them not euthanize all these puppies, right? So we experience dissonance, and in order to reduce the dissonance, the advertisement tells us you can help by donating $5 a month. And this is what your donation does. And so that can help us to justify choosing to donate in order to decrease that dissonance. So a lot of times those emotional testimonials, those emotional endorsements are really attempting to create that dissonance. And then if it's a good advertisement, if it's going to be effective, what they then do is give you a way to decrease the dissonance by doing this behavior, which will obviously help whoever is doing the advertisement. We've talked before about foot in the door and lowball techniques. So part of our message in terms of persuasion may be to use the foot in the door technique. Foot in the door technique is where we ask for something small, and then once the person agrees to it, then we ask for something larger. And typically, because the person agreed to the first request, they are more likely to agree to the second request. And we talked before in the behavior and attitudes chapter about how that may be because they start thinking of themselves as someone who helps. And so we don't want to experience dissonance because, well, I helped before, I'm a helper, and now I feel like I don't want to help. So I will agree to the second request so that I don't experience cognitive dissonance. So we probably did this as children, asking parents for, like, oh, can I have 50 cents for a cookie at school during lunch? And if the parent said yes, then we might say, well, can I have $1 so I can get a chocolate milk too? So this is using the foot in the door technique, something small and then asking for a larger request later. Now, the lowball technique is where we get someone to agree to something and then up the ante, and they still continue to agree with that because they already agreed to it. So we talked in the behavior and attitudes unit about purchasing a car. So they come to you and say it'll be $19,000. You agree to that. You start thinking of yourself as, driving away in this car. And then they come back and they say, oh, my manager said that it has to be at least 21,000 because we're going to lose money on this deal, which they're not. But anyway, and so because of the fact that you agreed to the 19,000, brain's like, well, but I really do want this car, and it's only $2,000 more. That's not a big deal. So you agree to that increase in price on the same item simply because you agreed to the first one. And keep in mind, as we've talked about before, you do not need to agree to the second request. Don't feel like you have to, help this person because they've spent time with you, things like that. Don't feel compelled to, if you experience snowball technique, don't feel compelled to agree to the second request simply because, oh, well, I've wasted this salesperson's time and now, they're going to lose money. Like, no, sorry. They're just trying to make more money off of you is what they're trying to do. Okay, so that's the difference between foot in the door, two separate requests. One is low, the second one is high, but they're for two separate things. Low ball is where the request is the same, it's just upping the ante. We can also talk about the door in the face technique. It's pretty much the opposite of the foot in the door technique. This is where, as a communicator, we ask for something huge, like absolutely ridiculous. And the person goes like, no. And then we're like, okay, how about this request? And usually the second request is what we really want from people. So we basically slam the door in their face with a huge request. And then we come back and say, or, what about this smaller request? And because of the fact that they said no to the first request, they may feel compelled to say yes to the second request because they feel like you, as the requester, have decreased your standards for them. So they might as well say yes to the second request. So I've talked to a lot of people who say, they were talking to their parents about prom dresses. And so they found this absolutely ridiculously priced prom dress that they didn't really want, but showed them, this $5,000 prom dress. And the parents were like, no, never, right? And then they showed them the prom dress they actually wanted, which was, $250, and said, well, okay, I guess this one's pretty cool too. And the parents were like, okay, that's better price. And if you had just presented this $250 dress to your parents would have been like, $250? No way. But now, because you have something to compare it to the $5,000 dress, like $250 is a deal, when it's really not. Okay, so it's all about that comparison and kind of showing the other person that you're willing to downgrade if they're willing to agree to that. That's the door in the face technique. We can also talk about how scarcity influences people's purchasing behavior. So if we hear that something is almost out of stock, then we may experience fear of missing out or FOMO. And a lot of companies are now using this online. So think about, last time you shopped at Etsy and it said, only 2 items left and 4 people have this in their carts. And you're like, oh my God, I need to buy this right now so that I actually end up getting it, because, if 4 people have it in their carts, then they're totally going to buy it and I'm going to miss out. So this causes us to experience psychological reactance. And so in order for us to get what we want, we have to buy it now, right? For me, as a social psychologist, I see that and go, whatever, because I don't know how many times I've put something in my cart on Etsy and it sat there for 4 months. So yeah, other people may have this in their cart, but they may be like me and have it in their cart to remind them to look at it, see if it goes on sale or something, but they're not actually going to purchase it. So I'm really not in any position where I might miss out. And you know what? If I do, if it, goes to sold out status, not such a big deal. But yeah, if we start talking about scarcity, there's a run on toilet paper, then people are going to go stock up on it, even if they don't need it, simply because it might not be available when I do need it, right? We've seen lots of examples of that in the past year or two. So we also want to think about in terms of the message. So let's say that we're the messenger. We're trying to persuade people to do something, right? We really want to figure out who is our target audience. So we want to look at some demographics of our target audience because we really want to specifically focus our message on the values, interests, and things that are important to our target audience. So a couple things that you would want to think about would be age. So if your target audience is people who are older, you might want to think about, older people are generally more conservative in terms of purchasing behaviors, in terms of political behaviors, in terms of political attitudes. And so if your target audience is older, then you want to take that into account. We also want to think about, have the people who you're trying to persuade already been reminded that persuasion attempts are coming? So do they know that you're going to try to persuade them to buy XYZ? If so, these folks can develop counter arguments. So in their head, they can go, okay, I know I'm going to this timeshare meeting. They're going to try to sell me a timeshare. So I'm going to come up with all these reasons why I can't buy a timeshare. If you're the person trying to sell the timeshare, you have to think of what their counter arguments are already going to be and figure out how to answer those counter arguments. So if the person says, well, I'm not really going to use it as much as I would want to for the price. You can, as the speaker, you could say, well, you know what, do you have family that might use it? Because you could actually gift your timeshare for the year as a Christmas gift to your children or to friends and family, things like that. So people are going to come up with counter arguments. And so it's going to be your job to figure out what are those potential counter arguments and how can you counter the counter arguments. If the target audience is distracted, if they're tired, if they are hungry, they're more likely and more easily persuaded because it keeps us from developing counter arguments and again leads to persuasion. So you may notice when you go into car dealerships that you tend to spend a lot of time there. It's almost like they make you hurry up and wait. And one of the potential reasons for that is that they're literally trying to tire down your brain so that you are making poorer decisions and you're not able to develop counter arguments. You may also notice that a lot of these places don't offer, food, snacks, things like that. They may offer, water bottle or a bag of peanuts or something like that, but it's really not enough. If you're there for like 6 hours, it's not enough for a meal. And so you're going to be hungry. And so again, making poor decisions and having trouble developing counter arguments. We also know that there is a personality trait called need for cognition. People who are high in this personality trait really like to learn stuff. And so if you recognize that the person that you are trying to persuade is high in the personality trait of need for cognition, then you're really going to want to focus on those central arguments as opposed to focusing on, for example, the attractiveness of the speaker. So I already answered my own question there. Should we use peripheral or central route? With people who are high in need for cognition, we should use the central route. And the definition of need for cognition is right there. So the motivation to think and analyze, and this, as I said, it's a personality trait. So you can recognize this high need for cognition or low need for cognition in people who you are trying to persuade, and then use that information to try to influence them. So let's talk about a very highly influential group, such as a new religious movement. So historically, we called new religious movements cults, and then the idea of the term cult developed this really negative connotation. And so researchers said, we don't want to be focusing on just the negatives of these groups, because some groups do have positive outcomes to them. And also the word cult kind of got used in a more spread out fashion. So we could talk about, the cult surrounding a music group, when in fact they don't actually have the behavioral traits associated with a cult, such as a charismatic leader who requires you to participate in isolation activities from other people who are not group members. There's no distinctive rituals or beliefs associated with, liking this music group, but we still think of it as like a cult following. So rather than try to say like, no, this is an actual cult as opposed to a cult following, we've changed the nomenclature, the words that we use, to talking about a new religious movement. And if you break that down, we're talking about, it's a religious movement, so it's got some spirituality behind it, and it is typically a new group. So if you think about it, almost all religions started out as being thought of as pretty culty, right? There was this Jesus guy, and people like followed him around, and they thought he had all of these like, amazing abilities. And if you think back to that and you look at, the stories surrounding Jesus and what people thought of him, there's definitely some thoughts from other people of like, those people that follow Jesus are definitely like culty, right? And eventually, if a cult becomes accepted by mainstream society as an actual religion, then we can talk about it as a religion, right? So this would basically be a new religious movement, is basically, a startup religion, and we'll see how long it continues. Now, keep in mind though, there's negative outcomes from these new religious movements that are perceived as cults. So people may lose all their money, people may lose their life, people may lose their associations with their family members because of the isolation that may be required by the cult or new religious movement. And one of the things that tends to happen in new religious movements is older members will talk to newer members and say, okay, if you're interacting with somebody outside of the group and they say, these bad things about the group, what are you going to say? And so they may give you some examples of how to respond to those sorts of statements. And then you practice them through role playing, which we've already talked about. Role playing can change our attitudes because our behaviors change. And so it feeds back into our attitudes. And so through practicing with being exposed to weak attacks on our beliefs, we develop these counter arguments, which we already talked about what those are, right? And this is what we call attitude inoculation. So it's almost like we are giving you a practice shot of what will happen when someone tries to speak negatively against our group, and you'll already have an arsenal of things to say that are well practiced, that so you won't sit there and go like, and the thing is if you, as a new individual in the group, if your beliefs get attacked because they're newer beliefs, it might be easier for another person to change your attitude. So an outside group member to change your attitude so that you leave the new religious movement. So the group members are definitely going to want you to practice, what would you say if someone said, oh, that's a cult? Like, no, actually cults involve, this and that, and it doesn't involve that, so it's not a cult. So being able to develop these counter arguments and quickly give them and practice them is what we call attitude inoculation. All right. I do have a video available where Amanda Montell, who's the author of a book called Cultish, talks about the language of fanaticism. And she does a really interesting job in this book talking about how groups use language in order to bring people in, to make them feel as if they are part of the group, and also to maintain the person's feeling of wanting to be part of that group and being part of that group. So I do have a video that I'll link in the comments area about her book. If you are interested in learning more about that, I do suggest it, and it's very well written. It's one of those things where I started reading it as an ebook, and I wanted to like have it in my hands and highlight the heck out of it. And I was like, yeah, I just go a copy of this book. I can't do ebook on this one. So how do we resist persuasion? That's always a great question. So attitude inoculation is going to be useful not just within new religious movements, but also within our lives. So let's think about when we were kids and our parents said, if someone offers you a cigarette, what are you going to say? So they were basically getting you to develop these counter arguments of how you're going to respond when peer pressure comes along and says, like, you're not cool unless you drink alcohol with us. How are you going to respond to that? What are you going to do? What are your behavioral options, and which one are you going to choose? So being able to practice how I'm going to respond to that, so that when it does actually come time for me to respond to it, I have something ready to go, and I can just be like, I'll be the designated driver. Thanks for asking now. So it makes it much easier for us to resist persuasion if we've already built up this arsenal of things that we could potentially say to people, so that we don't feel pressured into conforming to this persuasion attempt. All right. So if your parents were parents that, sat down with you and role played, okay, I'm your best friend and I want you to smoke weed, what are you going to do? Basically, they were helping you to develop attitude inoculation and helping you to develop counter arguments. So you want to think about, what might people try to persuade me to do, and how can I, develop counter arguments so that when those persuasion attempts come, then I'll be ready for them. One example of this, whenever I go to the mall, literally I open the door to the mall and my first thought is like, oh, those people in the middle of the mall and their kiosks that are going to want to sell, perfume or hair straighteners or whatever it is. Like, okay, so what am I going to say to those people today? Or how am I going to avoid interacting with them? Right. And I know sales is horrible and frustrating. And, some people really hate it. Some people really love it. But, I can understand being one of those people that works at one of those middle kiosks. So I don't want to be rude to them. But at the same time, like, I don't want your stuff and I don't want you to try to persuade me, like, go waste your time. Don't waste your time on me because I'm not buying. But I also don't want to say that because it sounds mean. So I always try to think of like, how can I nicely tell this person, like, you should move on because you're not going to get anything from me. So I'll just kind of smile and say, no, thank you, and keep walking. And so I'm not being rude. I am simply like letting you know, like, not a sale here. You can go talk to somebody else. And so this is quite literally me walking into the mall being like, okay, what's my counter argument to the middle kiosk people today? So we think about it beforehand, we come up with what we want to say, and then we have it ready so that we're not surprised by this persuasion attempt. So let's think about advertisements. And I always like to bring up like older advertisements just to kind of show students that, some of these older advertisements are really, can be really interesting. But you can also do this obviously with any advertisement today. So first thing we want to look for when we look at an advertisement is, what is the product? So the product here is lard. Yep, at one point they were advertising that, you should eat more lard, and apparently it makes you happy and look like these people is what the advertisement is trying to tell us. So channel of communication. So you always want to think about an advertisement in terms of, what's the channel of communication? This, I'm assuming, was a newspaper ad. We want to think about the target audience. So we probably here are thinking about, families. We're thinking about probably women, especially at the time period where this advertisement came out. Women were doing most of the cooking, most of the cleaning. And so if we think in terms of stereotypes, most likely they're targeting women. Women want their family to be happy. So if they want them to be happy, then they should eat lard, right? We also want to think about the age of people. So we're talking about family here, right? So at least early 20s probably. So people who are old enough to have their own children. Now, also think about these folks are wearing bathing suits. That indicates either there's a pool available to them or there's a beach available to them, which most likely indicates higher level of socioeconomic status than someone who may not have a pool or a beach available to them. So all of these things, you may think to yourself, like, you're getting all of this from this one advertisement. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we can also think about which components of our attitudes, remember, affect, mood, behavior, cognition, the ABCs of attitude. So what components of attitude does this advertisement appeal to? So it appeals to affect because, well, lard makes them happy. So I want to be happy. And so, okay, then I should be eating more lard, apparently. And it influences or tries to influence our behavior of the eating of and cooking with lard. And then cognitions, this focus isn't as much on cognitions. There's not really a lot of factual information here, aside from what they're reporting, which is that, happy people eat lard. Would it be more of a central or peripheral route to persuasion? Well, we don't have any facts here. So it would be more peripheral than central. One thing that I find interesting on this ad is that it's issued by the Lard Information Council, which I'm pretty sure is a little bit biased. So we want to take that into account as we're looking at this advertisement, but it is definitely a peripheral route to persuasion as opposed to the central route to persuasion. And then look at the source. So are these people attractive? My thought is, they're not unattractive, right? You don't look at them and go like, whoa. But are they credible? And the question becomes like, well, I don't know. Do they actually eat lard? Because if they do, and they look like this, then okay, they would be, more credible. But we don't actually know if these people eat lard or if they're just some sort of, family, which they may not even be a family. They may be just three random actors that they put together in order to put them for this picture, right? But we are supposed to perceive them as a family unit, again, which goes back to the target audience for this advertisement. So you want to take a look at different advertisements and see, okay, what is the product that's being advertised? What's the channel of communication? Who are the targets for the advertisement? Which components of attitudes does the advertisement appeal to? So affect, behavior, cognition. Is it central or peripheral route? And then are the sources attractive and are they credible? And I have two commercials for you. They're actually both from the same company, and they were both Super Bowl advertisements. And most of the time, Super Bowl advertisements are, well, first of all, they're very expensive. And so a lot of companies will almost kind of like try to put their best work out for the Super Bowl. And which, if you're interested in persuasion and advertising, the Super Bowl is just so much fun because you get to watch all these different commercials and go like, ooh, that was a good one. Or I have no idea what that was for. That was a bad commercial. So I do have in the links area, I do have the links to two different commercials. And as I said, they were both Super Bowl advertisements. They're actually both from the same company, as I said, and you'll be able to see which one. There's one that's not so good because it leaves you with like this feeling of like, what the hell just happened? And then there's another one that's really good and makes you feel positive affect at the end of it, which could then transfer to the product being advertised. So like I said, I will put the links to both of those in the comments, and you can see which one do you think is the good one, which one do you think is the bad one. And then here are my references for today. We do have our whole chapter on persuasion. The NOBA online textbook also has a chapter on persuasion as well. There's lots of resources in the module relating to persuasion, which can help you to learn more as well. So I look forward to our next topic.